So today I'm going to be talking about friction, and the force of friction can be hard to understand. However, it's actually not all that difficult. So the equation that defines friction and static friction is the force of friction is equal to the coefficient of static friction, kinetic friction times the normal. And this equation doesn't work for static friction because sometimes it can be less than the coefficient times the normal. So I'll talk about that in a second. But just to get your mind around it, remember this equation for kinetic friction. There are two types of coefficients, and I've already brought up the second one, kinetic friction, which is once there's movement between surfaces. And I forgot to mention that the force of friction is present whenever there is when there's two surfaces together, and these two different types of friction occur depending on whether the two objects are moving or not. Kinetic friction happens when there is movement between the surfaces, and static friction happens when there's pretty simple in that point. To note about the coefficients, that the coefficient of static friction is always greater than the coefficient of kinetic friction. And this makes sense because in static friction is when there's no motion, so you have to apply more force to get the object moving in order to overcome the force of static friction. And that's why the frictional force of static friction is either less than or equal to the coefficient of static friction, u of s, or actually it's mu of s, times the normal. And that means that it resists motion up to this amount of force, and anything lower than that coefficient times the normal causes no movement. So if this weight upon the surface, and let's say that the coefficient of static friction in this case is 1, and the normal in this case is 1, just to make, or 2, just to make it easy. The frictional force the force that I have to apply to get the object moving this way would have to be greater than 2 in order to overcome the view of static force. However, if I only applied a force of 1 Newton, I wouldn't be able to move this, but there would still be that much static friction. And going back to kinetic friction, once the object is already in motion, it's much easier to keep it in motion, and so therefore kinetic friction has a lower coefficient, or a smaller coefficient than that of static friction in the same situation.